The gun went off before Florence Monroe even had time to scream. The sound split the dry Arizona air like a thunderclap, and every living soul inside Hargrove's trading post froze in place. Dust motes hung suspended in the afternoon light streaming through the cracked window panes. The smell of gunpowder mingled with dried tobacco and leather. And there stood Florence, her dark hair unraveling from its pins, her green eyes wide not with fear but with something fiercer, something that made the hair on the back of Albert Quinn's neck stand straight up. Because she wasn't cowering. She was standing directly in front of old Elias Tanner's grandson, a 9-year-old boy named Cody, her arms spread wide, her body an absolute wall between the child and the furious, half-drunk rancher named Wade Creighton who had just discharged his Colt revolver into the ceiling boards above their heads. Plaster rained down. Women screamed. Men scrambled behind barrels and shelving units loaded with dried beans and bolts of cotton cloth. But Florence Monroe did not move. "You step aside, woman," Wade Creighton snarled, his thick mustache trembling with rage, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the boy she was protecting. "That brat threw a rock through my wagon wheel spoke, and I intend to see him pay for it." "He is 9 years old," Florence said, and her voice was so steady, so utterly without tremor that Albert Quinn, watching from the far corner near the hardware shelving, felt something shift deep inside his chest. A kind of recognition, a kind of awe. He threw a pebble. "You will not touch him." Creighton raised the gun again. "I said step aside." And I said no. Albert had been in this territory for 2 years. He had seen brave men. He had ridden with riders who feared nothing that crawled or walked this earth. But he had never, not once, seen anyone stand the way Florence Monroe was standing in that moment, her jaw set like ironwood, her slight frame somehow larger than the space it occupied, her green eyes locked on Creighton's without so much as a flutter. He moved. It was reflex more than decision, his body crossing the trading post floor in 4 long strides before his mind had fully registered the danger. He put himself beside Florence, not in front of her because something told him she would resent that, and he placed one hand very calmly on the counter beside him, his stance open, his voice low. "Mr. Creighton," he said, "I believe you're bleeding from your left hand. Looks like that recoil caught you. You might want to let Doc Hensley see to that before it turns." The distraction worked the way distraction sometimes does with men who are more drunk than dangerous. Creighton glanced at his hand. Florence grabbed Cody and pulled him behind the counter, and by the time Wade Creighton looked back up, the moment had passed, the heat of it gone out like a doused flame. But the thing that had shifted inside Albert Quinn's chest did not go back to where it had been. He had noticed Florence Monroe before that day. Of course he had. He had been coming to Hargrove's trading post every 2 weeks for supplies since the spring of 1883, and Florence had worked the counter for most of that time, ever since her husband had died of a fever the previous summer, and left her alone in a territory that did not know what to do with a widow who refused to go back east. He had noticed the efficient way she moved through the narrow aisles, the way she kept the ledger without a single error, the way she handled difficult customers with a cool politeness that never crept into anything warmer or colder than necessary. He had noticed the small scar above her left eyebrow and the way she wore her hair, always twisted up but always escaping in 1 or 2 dark curls around her temples. He had noticed all of it, the way a man notices things he is trying very hard not to notice. But he had not understood until this exact moment, with plaster still drifting down from the ceiling and old Hargrove himself emerging shakily from behind his sugar barrel, what kind of woman Florence Monroe actually was. She was the bravest person in the room, and Albert Quinn, standing there with his heart doing something uncomfortable and unfamiliar, was the only man who seemed to understand that. Florence Monroe had come to Sulphur Creek, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1881 with her husband, Thomas Monroe, who had big dreams about cattle ranching and very little practical experience with either cattle or the realities of the Arizona landscape. Thomas had been a good man, kind and enthusiastic and thoroughly unprepared for the relentless heat and the dry seasons and the disease that could move through a settlement faster than any storm. He had lasted 2 years, which was longer than the optimists predicted and shorter than Florence prayed for, and when the fever took him in August of 1882, Florence had been 26 years old, 300 miles from the nearest family she possessed, and in possession of a small homestead that she neither owned outright nor had the capital to maintain. She could have gone back. She could have written to her mother in Columbus, Ohio, and asked for train fare, and her mother would have sent it, along with a letter full of relief and well-meaning declarations about how she had always known that Arizona was no place for a woman of Florence's constitution. Florence had not written that letter. Instead, she had walked into Hargrove's trading post on a Tuesday morning in September with a straight back and clean hands, and told old Jacob Hargrove that she needed work and could keep a ledger better than anyone he currently employed, which at that time was a 17-year-old boy named Pete who could barely add two-digit numbers. Hargrove had looked her over with the particular brand of skepticism that older men in the territory reserved for women who appeared to believe they could manage things, and Florence had opened his ledger book right there on the counter and shown him 5 errors in the past week's accounts. She had started the following Monday. The trading post was the heart of Sulphur Creek in the way that such places always were in 1883 Arizona. It was the postal station, the informal bank, the place where disputes were sometimes settled and news always exchanged, where a man could outfit himself for a cattle drive or a prospecting expedition, and where the women of the settlement came for cloth and thread and the small luxuries that made the hard life more bearable. Florence knew the stock inside and out within the first month. She knew which families were running low on credit and which ones would pay when the cattle drives paid out. She knew who was honest and who was not, who needed a firm hand and who needed a gentle word. She had learned, too, that being a woman alone in a place like Sulphur Creek carried its own particular set of dangers, not the dramatic dangers of outlaws and gunfights, though those existed, the quieter dangers, the men who interpreted her solitary state as an open invitation, the women who kept their distance because a widow without visible prospects was either an object of pity or a threat to domestic arrangements, the practical dangers of maintaining a homestead alone on a teacher's wages when the roof needed repair and the well needed deepening. Florence had handled all of it. She had handled it with a practicality that occasionally frightened even herself, because she did not have the luxury of falling apart and she had always known it. What she had not handled, what she had not expected and did not know how to categorize, was Albert Quinn. Albert had come to Sulphur Creek in the spring of 1881, the same season as Florence and Thomas, but their paths had rarely crossed in those early months. He had taken on work at the Caldwell Ranch south of town, riding fence and managing the small crew that kept the cattle from wandering into the desert arroyos. He was quiet and capable, and he kept to himself in the way that men in the territory often did, with a careful containment about him that Florence had initially read as coldness and later revised to something more complicated. He was from Missouri. She knew that much. He had mentioned it once briefly, when she had asked about a letter that came through the post addressed to a Mrs. Agnes Quinn in Jefferson City. His mother, he had said, his eyes going somewhere else for a moment, somewhere she did not follow him to. That was the extent of what she knew about his past. He was 31 years old to her 27. He was tall, lean in the way that outdoor labor makes men lean, with dark eyes and a jaw that was usually carrying 2 or 3 days of stubble and hands that were permanently weathered from the work. He read. That had surprised her the first time she noticed it, a battered copy of Dickens in his coat pocket when he came in for supplies. She had made a comment about it, something mild and observational, and he had looked at her with those dark eyes and said simply that he found it helped him sleep at night and then he had paid for his supplies and left. That had been 8 months ago. In the 8 months since, they had managed perhaps 40 conversations, none of which Florence could have classified as personal. He was courteous in a way that was not exactly formal but also not warm, as if he maintained a precise calibrated distance from everything and everyone and was very deliberate about keeping it. She had respected that. She had, if she was being thoroughly honest with herself, appreciated it, because the men who did not maintain that distance were the men she found exhausting. What she had not anticipated was how loudly his absence spoke when he was not there, or how the 40 conversations she could not classify as personal had somehow accumulated into a weight she could feel. She thought about this in the evenings after she closed the trading post and walked the half-mile back to her small homestead on the edge of town, while the sky went orange and purple over the desert mesas, and the air finally cooled from its daytime furnace temperature. She thought about it with a kind of stern disapproval directed at herself, because she was a practical woman, and she knew the arithmetic of her situation clearly. She was a widow with no savings and a leaking roof, and no immediate prospects of changing either of those facts, and Albert Quinn was a ranch hand with a contained past who had given her no indication whatsoever that he thought of her as anything other than the woman who kept the ledger at the trading post. And then the incident with Wade Creighton happened, and something about the arithmetic changed in ways Florence could not immediately calculate. She did not thank him. Not that day, because after Creighton left and the post settled back into its usual rhythms, there were 3 customers waiting and Hargrove was shaking with delayed shock and needed talking down. And by the time Florence turned to say anything to Albert Quinn, he was already gone. She saw his broad shoulders passing through the door, unhurried, a packet of nails in one hand, and then he was out into the white blinding afternoon, and she was left standing behind her counter with her heart beating somewhat faster than she wanted it to. She thanked him the following Thursday when he came in for his 2 weekly supplies. "Mr. Quinn," she said as he set his list on the counter with that quiet efficiency of his. He looked up. "Thank you for what you did last week with Creighton." Something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read. "You didn't need me," he said. "You had it." "I might have had it," she said carefully because she was honest and could not entirely claim otherwise, "but having someone stand beside me made it steadier." He held her gaze for a moment, 2 moments. Something moved through the air between them that neither of them reached for, and then he looked down at his list and said in his measured way, "How is the boy?" "Cody, he's fine. His grandfather brought him in yesterday. He wanted to thank me, though the way he phrased it suggested he thought I had been somewhat reckless." She paused. He was not entirely wrong. "He was wrong," Albert said, and the certainty in his voice caught her like a hand on her arm. He did not elaborate. He picked up the pencil and pointed to the first item on his list, and she pulled herself back to the business of the counter, but the certainty of those 2 words sat with her for the rest of the afternoon. He was wrong. 2 words. Florence had spent the better part of her marriage being told, in various gentle and well-meaning ways, that she was somewhat too much. Too direct, too capable, too unwilling to arrange herself into the shape that made other people comfortable. Thomas had loved her, she believed that truly, but he had also spent a great deal of their marriage slightly bewildered by her, as if he had expected something softer and was perpetually readjusting to what he had actually gotten. He was wrong, said without qualification, without the pause that precedes a correction or a softening. Just the statement, flat and final and utterly sure. Florence Monroe had not been made to feel thoroughly right in a very long time. She took her time with his supplies after that, which was not like her. She was efficient by habit and inclination, and she did not dawdle, but she took an extra moment checking the quality of the dried beef she was wrapping, and she asked, not looking up from the brown paper, whether he had heard that old Hargrove was thinking of expanding the post to include a small hardware section along the south wall. "I hadn't heard that," Albert said. "He mentioned it this week. I think the Caldwell Ranch ordering their hardware through us rather than from Tucson tipped the scales." A pause. "That would be good for the post. I thought so too. She tied off the parcel. Of course, it means reorganizing the south wall, which is going to be a project. I've been trying to convince Mr. Hargrove to let me redraw the floor plan before we start moving shelving. Have you drawn it up already? She looked at him then, because the question was direct and interested in a way she had not expected. I have a rough draft. I'm decent with spatial arrangements, he said, if you wanted another eye on it. She did not let herself read too much into this. It was a practical offer, man to colleague, nothing more than the kind of assistance that people in small communities rendered to one another without sentiment. That would be useful, she said. I usually work on the books after closing on Fridays, if you wanted to stop by. He nodded, paid for his supplies, and left. Florence stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, her hands flat on the smooth wood, and took a breath that was slightly longer than necessary. He came on Friday evening. Old Hargrove was gone by then, which was usual. He lived above the post but took his supper at the Caldwell Hotel every evening, a ritual that occupied him from 6 until 8, and Florence was always alone in the post for those 2 hours, doing the weekly accounts at the back table by the light of the oil lamp. She had the rough drawing spread out on the counter when Albert knocked on the door frame at 6:30. They spent an hour on the floor plan. It was a genuinely useful hour. Albert had a practical eye, and he pointed out correctly that the reorganization she proposed would create a choke point at the main entrance during busy periods, and he suggested an alternative arrangement that she had not considered but immediately saw the logic of. She had a pencil in her hand, and they were both bent over the counter studying the drawing, and at some point she became aware that they were standing very close together, his shoulder barely 6 inches from hers, and that the awareness of it was doing something distracting to her concentration. She moved back slightly and began talking about the inventory implications of the new layout. He answered her seriously and without apparent awareness of the charge that had been in the air a moment before, and Florence decided that she had imagined it, or that if she had not imagined it she was going to behave as if she had, because she was a practical woman and she did not have the time or the emotional latitude for complications. But then he stayed after the floor plan was finished. He did not do it obviously. He had a cup of the coffee she had brewed earlier on the small stove in the back room, and he asked about the Tanner family, whether old Elias had recovered from his chest cold, and she answered. And then he asked about the letter she had mentioned 2 weeks ago regarding postal routes, and she answered that too, and 40 minutes passed without either of them seeming to notice. And when he finally set down his coffee cup and said he should let her finish her accounts, the room felt measurably colder without him in it. Florence sat down at her back table and looked at the ledger for a full 5 minutes without writing a single figure. The season turned through September and into October, and the high desert began its slide toward the winter cold that newcomers always underestimated. The sky went from its summer brass to something harder and cleaner, a deep blue that sat above the mesas like a promise. The trading post filled up with the particular autumn business of people laying in stores for the difficult months ahead, and Florence was busy from morning to close most days. Albert came every 2 weeks as always, and they talked, and the conversations had moved without either of them formally acknowledging it into territory that was no longer purely practical. She knew now that he had come west originally to escape something that had happened in Missouri, though he had not told her what. She knew that he sent money home to his mother every month, a detail that had emerged sideways from a conversation about the postal charges, and that had told her more about him than he probably realized. She knew that he had served briefly with the Union Army near the end of the war, that he had been 15 at the time and had lied about his age, and that the experience had left him with a profound and specific distrust of men who gave orders without understanding the consequences. He knew, because she told him in her direct way, that she had been a schoolteacher in Columbus before her marriage, that she had come west willingly, and not simply as an appendage to Thomas's ambitions, and that she intended to remain in Sulphur Creek because she had put down roots in this hard soil whether anyone thought it was sensible or not. He knew that she could ride and shoot, skills she had acquired with great purpose in her first year in the territory, and he knew that the roof of her homestead leaked in 3 places, and she had been trying to save enough from her wages to have it properly repaired before winter proper set in. She knew he was lonely. She did not say this because he had not said it, but she could see it in the way the trading post hours stretched for him, the way a conversation that was supposed to be about a nail order turned into an hour of quiet talk, the way he sometimes paused before leaving as if weighing the cost of going back to an empty bunkhouse against the impropriety of staying longer. She was lonely too. She knew her own condition clearly enough. The complication arrived, as complications in the territory often did, without warning and with its own forceful agenda. His name was Randall Crew, and he rode into Sulphur Creek on a Wednesday morning in late October with 2 other men, and a demeanor that Florence clocked as dangerous before he had opened his mouth. She had learned to read the particular combination of entitled ease and suppressed aggression that characterized men who were accustomed to taking what they wanted without asking, and Randall Crew had it all through him the way a rattlesnake has its pattern. He was handsome in a hard way, with pale eyes and expensive boots, and a way of looking at the trading post stock that suggested calculation rather than commerce. His companions were quieter, watching the room with the professional assessment of men paid to watch rooms. Florence served them with her usual efficiency. Randall Crew bought tobacco and a quantity of ammunition, and a bottle of the rye whiskey she kept behind the counter, and at the end of the transaction he leaned on the counter and looked at her with those pale eyes and said, "You run this place alone, miss." "I manage the accounts for Mr. Hargrove," Florence said, writing the total in the ledger. "That will be $2.40. Hargrove's a smart man," Crew said, not reaching for his money yet. "Getting a pretty woman behind his counter, good for business." Florence looked at him directly. $2.40, Mr. Crew, he smiled. He paid. He left, but the look he gave her on the way out was the kind of look that followed a person, and Florence did not like it. She found out later that day, from the blacksmith's wife who came in for thread, that Randall Crew and his associates had taken rooms at the Caldwell Hotel and were apparently in Sulphur Creek on cattle-buying business, though the blacksmith's wife's tone suggested she found this explanation incomplete. Albert heard about it within the hour, because Sulphur Creek was that size of town. He came in the following morning, which was not his usual day, and Florence knew the moment she saw his face that he had heard something that concerned him. "The man who came in yesterday," he said, after the pleasantries were done and the counter between them was free of other customers. "Randall Crew." "Yes, I know of him." Albert's voice was careful. "From before I came out here. He worked the Missouri River country in the 70s. He has a reputation for acquiring things that don't entirely belong to him." Florence set down her pencil. "What kind of things?" "Cattle, mostly, but also other kinds of assets. He identifies properties where the legal standing is unclear or where the owner is in a vulnerable position, and he creates situations that encourage them to sell below value." The thing that Albert was not saying sat between them clearly. "You think he's looking at homesteads," Florence said. "I think he's looking at the whole area, and I think the fact that he singled you out to talk to, knowing you work the accounts here, might not have been accidental." Florence was quiet for a moment. She thought about the way Randall Crew had looked at the shelves, that calculating survey. She thought about her own homestead, the lease arrangement that was not quite a full deed, the $300 debt she still carried against the property. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Florence," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix, and it landed on her like a warm hand. "I want you to be careful." She held his gaze. "I am always careful." "I know," he said quietly. "But sometimes careful isn't enough, and having someone else know the situation matters." It was the most directly personal thing he had ever said to her. She filed it away, carefully, and told him she would let him know if anything developed. What developed came faster than either of them anticipated. Randall Crew came back to the trading post on Thursday afternoon, alone this time, and the conversation began normally enough with a purchase of coffee and dried goods, but at the end of it, he casually mentioned that he had been doing some looking at the land holdings in the area, and he understood that she carried a lease on a homestead property northeast of town. Florence put both hands flat on the counter. "Where did you hear that?" "It's public record at the county seat," Crew said smoothly. "I like to do my homework. I understand the lease has a balloon payment coming due in February, $300. The figure was correct. Florence had known about the February payment for months. She had been calculating and recalculating the savings she would have by then, and the number was close but not certain, and the uncertainty was the kind that kept her awake at night. "What's your interest in my lease, Mr. Crew? I might be able to offer you a solution to the February problem," he said. "Buy the lease from you at a fair price, maybe a little over what you owe on it. You walk away with cash in hand and no more worrying about payments you might not be able to make." Florence looked at him steadily. "And what would you do with the property?" He shrugged. "Development. Possibly fold it into a larger arrangement. You'd be clear of it either way." "I don't want to be clear of it," Florence said. "It's my home." "Think on it," Crew said. He smiled that smooth, calculating smile. "The offer won't stay open indefinitely." After he left, Florence sat down on the stool behind the counter for a moment. The post was empty. She breathed in and breathed out and looked at the ledger in front of her and did the arithmetic one more time. The same arithmetic she had done 100 times in the past 2 months, and the numbers still sat on the edge of a precipice. She was not going to sell. That was certain. But the February payment was real, and Crew's interest in her property was not accidental, and she needed to understand what he was actually planning before she could figure out how to counter it. She wrote a letter that evening to the county land office in Tucson, requesting a copy of her full lease terms and a review of any filings against the property. She also, the following morning when Albert came in, told him what had happened. She watched his face as she talked and noted the way his jaw set, and his eyes went very still in a particular way she was beginning to recognize as controlled anger. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's testing whether you'll panic," Albert said. "I know I'm not going to. I know you're not." He paused. "The $300, do you have it?" Florence felt a flicker of something that was pride and vulnerability braided together, which was uncomfortable. "I'll have most of it by February, but there's a gap." "How much of a gap?" She looked at him very directly. "Mr. Quinn, I am not asking you for money." "I know," he said with patience. "I'm asking you the size of the problem so I can think about whether there's a solution that doesn't involve selling your home to someone who clearly intends to squeeze this whole area dry." The way he said "your home" made something ache in her chest. She told him the gap was approximately $80, which was a significant sum on her wages but not impossible. He was quiet again. Then, "I've been working at the Caldwell Ranch for 2 years and I haven't spent much. I can lend you the $80 against whatever terms feel fair to you. Albert." It was the first time she had used his given name too, and they both noticed it. The air between them shifted the way it had over the floor plan drawings, that same charged quality that Florence had decided she was going to behave as if she had not felt. She found she was not able to make that decision this time. "That is extremely generous," she said carefully, "and I'm not saying no to it, but I need you to understand that I would treat it as a formal loan with interest and a specific repayment schedule." "However you need to do it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, careful man with his contained past and his dark eyes and the way he had said he was wrong with such absolute certainty. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she appreciated more than she could say. Because you should not lose your home because a man like Randall Crew has decided to make your situation into an opportunity, he said. And because I would not forgive myself if I could have helped and didn't. Florence felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling for several months make itself fully known inside her chest, warm and frightening and undeniable. She looked down at her ledger. "I'll draw up the terms," she said. "Thank you." Randall Crew did not confine his attentions to Florence's homestead, which became clear over the following 2 weeks. He had men looking at 3 other properties northeast of town, all of them in the same land grant area, all of them with lease arrangements rather than full deeds, all of them owned by people without strong legal resources. One of these was the Delgado family, who had been in the area longer than any of the Anglo settlers and whose claim, despite its age, was exactly the kind of complicated historical arrangement that men like Crew had been exploiting across the territory for years. Florence wrote another letter, this one to a lawyer she had heard of in Tucson who specialized in land disputes. She also had a long conversation with Maria Delgado, who was 45 and fierce, and who had the best memory for detail of anyone Florence had ever met, and between them they began assembling a picture of what Crew was actually doing. He was not just buying leases. He had a partner at the county land office who was, it appeared, selectively misfilling payments to create appearance of default where none actually existed. A lease payment made in good faith, delivered by hand to the county seat, could be recorded as late or missing entirely, and the resulting paperwork gave Crew legal grounds to challenge ownership. It was careful and sophisticated and completely corrupt, and Florence felt cold fury unfurl in her stomach when she understood the full shape of it. She told Albert. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to trust absolutely, this quality of listening as if what she was saying mattered entirely. When she finished, he said, "You need to deliver your February payment in person with witnesses and get a notarized receipt." "I know. I've already arranged it. Maria Delgado is coming with me to Tucson. We're going in late January, early enough to get ahead of any tampering." He looked at her and the look held something that was more than appreciation. "That's well thought out. I have also," she said, pulling the letter from the lawyer out from under the counter, "received this. He's looked at the land grant records, and he believes the Delgado claim is actually stronger than anyone has given it credit for, including the Delgados themselves. If we can get the original Spanish land grant records from the mission archives, we can potentially challenge the entire county filing system that Crew has been exploiting." Albert read the letter carefully. When he looked up, his eyes were different, bright with something that might have been admiration. "Florence Monroe," he said. "Yes. You are one of the most formidable people I have ever met." She felt heat move into her face, which was an occurrence so rare that it startled her. She was not, generally speaking, someone who blushed. "I am trying to solve a practical problem," she said. "That's what makes it formidable," he said. She looked at him for a moment too long, and then she looked away, and the flutter in her chest was undeniable, and she did not, this time, try to deny it. Randall Crew made his next move before Florence had expected him to. It came on a Monday morning in mid-November, when 2 men she did not recognize came into the trading post and presented a letter from the county assessor's office claiming that there was a discrepancy in the boundary description of her lease and that an on-site assessment was required within 10 days or the lease would be placed in review. It was the exact tactic the lawyer had warned her about in the letter. Florence took the letter, read it once, folded it, and placed it under the counter. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. "I'll have my lawyer respond to this by Wednesday." The men looked at each other. "The assessment has to be conducted on the property," one of them said. "My lawyer will be in touch with the assessor's office about scheduling," Florence said, in a tone that was both courteous and absolutely immovable, and then she turned to serve the next customer because she was not going to give these men more of her time. She wrote to the Tucson lawyer immediately and sent Pete on a horse with the letter the same afternoon. That evening, Walking home in the early dark of November, she heard footsteps behind her and felt the particular unease that comes from being alone on a quiet road with an unfamiliar sound. She turned around and found one of Crew's associates, the quieter one with the watching eyes, standing 20 feet back. "Evening, Miss Monroe," he said. Florence kept her voice absolutely steady. "Mr. Crew's business with me goes through my lawyer," she said. "Mr. Crew thought you might like to reconsider the offer," the man said, taking a step forward. "I would not," Florence said. She kept walking. She did not run. Her heart was moving at twice its usual rate, and her hand was on the small revolver she had taken to carrying in her coat pocket since October, and she was aware of the footsteps behind her and the distance to her homestead, and the weight of the gun in her hand with her finger nowhere near the trigger, because she was thinking clearly even when frightened, which was the practical skill that mattered most in the territory. The footsteps stopped. She got home, locked the door, lit the lamp, and sat down at the table with her hands flat in front of her, breathing slowly and deliberately until her heart slowed. She told Albert the following morning. She watched him hear it. She watched the controlled anger move through him the way weather moves through a sky, visible in his jaw and his eyes, and the careful way he put down the thing he was holding. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to walk you home in the evenings," he said. Florence considered this. "That's not necessary. It might become necessary, and I would like to do it whether it's necessary or not." She heard what was underneath this, the first real statement of personal feeling he had made, and she found herself unwilling to deflect it or reframe it as practicality. "All right," she said quietly. He began walking her home that evening. They went through the November dark together, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and they talked about ordinary things, the post, the cattle, the way the winter was coming in differently this year, harder and drier. The conversation was easy in a way that was itself a kind of intimacy, the ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms without a formal lesson, and Florence felt warm in spite of the cold. At the door of her homestead she stopped and turned to look at him, and in the lamplight coming through her window his face was something she wanted very much to keep looking at for a long time. "Albert," she said quietly. "Yes, I am not asking for protection. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering protection, I'm offering company." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Company," she repeated, "if you want it." She looked at him in the quiet dark of the desert November, the stars enormous above the mesas, the cold, clean air between them. "I want it," she said, and she meant more than the walks, and she thought he knew it. He did not reach for her hand. He was too careful for that, or perhaps too respectful. Or perhaps he simply understood that what was between them needed to build at its own pace without being rushed. But he smiled, and it was a different kind of smile than she had seen from him before, something warmer and less contained, and she carried that smile inside the house with her, and it was still warm at midnight when she finally went asleep. The trip to Tucson happened in the last week of January, 1884. Florence and Maria Delgado took the stage together on a Tuesday morning, both dressed in their best, both carrying document cases. They spent 4 days in Tucson. They filed Florence's lease payment with a full notarized record and 3 witnesses. They met with the lawyer, a serious, careful man named Hartwell who took the case against Crew's county filing partner with genuine interest and no small amount of professional outrage. They spent an afternoon at the mission archives with a very old archivist who had been extremely skeptical of the entire enterprise, until Maria Delgado began speaking to him in Spanish about the specific land grant in question, at which point his skepticism gave way to a focused interest that resulted in them leaving with copies of documents that were, in Hartwell's later assessment, exactly as strong as he had hoped. Florence came back to Sulphur Creek on a Saturday afternoon with the notarized payment receipt and the mission documents and a formal letter from Hartwell to Randall Crew advising him that the land grant challenge was proceeding and that any further pressure tactics directed at leaseholders in the area would be documented and brought to the attention of the territorial governor's office. Albert was at the stage stop when they arrived. He was standing with his hat in his hands, which was the kind of thing she was not going to read into, and he helped her down from the stage with a hand that held her fingers a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when she looked up at him and said, "We got everything," the thing that crossed his face was relief and pride together, and she felt it echo in her own chest. Randall Crew left Sulphur Creek the following week. He did not go quietly. There was a visit to Hargroves from one of his men, and a general sense of unpleasantness hanging over the town for several days. But he went, and the filings he had been exploiting at the county seat were subsequently investigated by Hartwell's suit, and the county official involved was removed from his position before spring. The Delgado claim was formally recognized in March. Florence made the final payment on her lease in February with the notarized receipt in hand, and $80 of Albert Quinn's money making up the difference. And on the ride back from the county seat, she worked out a repayment schedule that she wrote neatly on a folded piece of paper and presented to him the following Monday with an expression that he later said was the most perfectly balanced combination of pride and gratitude he had ever seen on a human face. He had laughed. She had laughed too. They were still laughing when old Hargrove came in from the back room wanting to know what was funny, and neither of them had an answer for him. The winter gave way to a slow and tentative spring. The desert bloomed in the way it did after cold winters, with more color than you expected from that hard ground, and the mornings were cool and bright, and the evenings stretched longer and the walks home became longer too, neither of them hurrying. In March, Albert fixed the 3 leaks in her roof. He appeared on a Saturday morning with timber and roofing materials that he had purchased from the post without telling her, which she found out only when she checked the ledger the following week and found the transaction entered in his name, and she had a strong emotional reaction to this that she decided to process before she said anything about it. The reaction contained gratitude and tenderness and irritation, and something that was none of those things but larger than all of them together. She said nothing about it when he came in the following Thursday because she had not yet finished processing, and instead asked him about the repair and whether the structure above the bedroom was sound, and he told her about the timber he had replaced and why it had been necessary, and she listened and watched his hands move as he described the work and felt the large, undefinable thing in her chest settle into something she recognized. She loved him. She had probably known it for longer than she was willing to admit, but she knew it clearly now, in the way she sometimes knew the precise moment when the accounts balanced, a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with the accumulation of truth. She set the pencil down. "Albert," she said. He looked at her. She had prepared something to say, something careful and appropriately measured that acknowledged the situation without overextending it, but standing there with him looking at her with those dark, patient eyes in the morning light of the trading post, all the preparation left her. "You fixed my roof," she said, "without asking." "I should have asked," he said, careful as always. "No," she said, "I was not criticizing it, I was noting it, because it is one of a very long list of things you have done for me in the past several months that have accumulated to the point that I cannot continue pretending they are simply neighborly." The stillness that came over him was different from his usual contained quiet. This was the stillness of something held very carefully in place. "What are they?" he asked, very softly. "They are evidence," she said, and she could feel her heart beating, "that you care for me in a way that is not simply neighborly. And I want you to know that the feeling is entirely mutual and has been for some time, and that I have been very busy pretending otherwise because I am a practical woman and I was not certain you wanted me to stop pretending." He came around the counter. He had never been on her side of the counter before. The distance closed between them and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the charged quality that had lived in the air between them for the better part of 8 months became something she was finally standing inside of, not observing from a careful distance. "Florence," he said, and her name in his voice was everything. "Yes," she said simply, before he had asked anything, because she was done with careful distance and the arithmetic of practical considerations, and all the small managed spaces she had built between herself and the things she wanted. He took her face in his weathered hands with extraordinary gentleness and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind of kiss that comes after a long and careful restraint, full and certain and warm. And Florence put both her hands on his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms and thought, with the clarity that characterized her even in the most emotionally overwhelming moments of her life, that she was very glad she had not gone back to Columbus. They were still standing like that, forehead to forehead, when old Hargrove came through the back door and stopped so abruptly that he knocked over a broom. "Well," he said, and then, after a pause that lasted approximately 3 seconds, "About time." Florence laughed. Albert laughed. And old Hargrove, shaking his head at the ways of people, picked up the broom and went back through the door and gave them another moment, which they used well. Spring moved into summer, and the territory heated back up to its furnace temperatures, and nothing about the day-to-day physical reality of Sulphur Creek changed. But something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere of the trading post, and Florence was aware, because she was always aware of everything in her environment, that people noticed it. The women who had kept a polite distance from the widow Monroe began to find reasons to linger at the counter. Mrs. Caldwell, the ranch owner's wife, who was a formidable woman in her own right, stopped Florence at the post one afternoon and told her directly that she was glad things had worked out with the lease situation, and that Florence had handled the entire crew business with more sense than most men she knew would have, which was the highest compliment that woman gave, and Florence received it accordingly. Albert came to the trading post every day now, not every 2 weeks. Sometimes he had a purchase. Sometimes he had a question about the post accounts, because Hargrove had begun consulting him on the hardware expansion, and his opinion was relevant. Sometimes he came in the evenings after closing, and they talked at the back table over coffee, while the oil lamp made a warm circle of light against the wide Arizona dark. He told her, in those evenings, about Missouri. He told her about his father, who had been a difficult and exacting man who could not be satisfied by anything Albert did, and who had spent most of Albert's youth making sure he knew it. He told her about the years after the war when he had tried to make something work in Jefferson City and had found himself in a situation. He was careful about the details, that had ended badly enough that leaving was the only option that preserved what was left of his integrity. He told her that he had spent 2 years in Sulphur Creek mostly convincing himself that he was not capable of anything more permanent than work and privacy. "And then," Florence asked, "and then you stood in front of a child with your arms spread out and told Wade Creighton no," he said, "and I understood that I had been wrong about what I was capable of." She was quiet for a moment, holding her coffee cup. "What were you wrong about?" "I thought I was not capable of wanting a life," he said. "A real one with someone in it." She looked at him across the small table, the lamp between them, the desert outside the window doing its ancient silent things. "I thought the same thing," she said. "After Thomas died, I told myself that I had had a life and it was over, and what I had now was a practical arrangement with existence." "What changed your mind?" she smiled. "You listened to me like what I was saying mattered. For about 8 months before anything else happened, you just listened like I was worth listening to. That turned out to be more than I knew how to defend against." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm over and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight for a while without needing to say anything else. He proposed to her in May, on the walk home in the warm evening, with the desert in its brief spectacular bloom, and the sky going every color it knew between blue and dark. He did it without grand ceremony, which was exactly right for both of them. He stopped walking and turned to her and said that he had been thinking about the subject of permanence and whether she had any thoughts on the matter. Florence had looked at him for a moment with those green eyes that read everything, and then she had said, "I have quite a lot of thoughts on the matter. Most of them are yes." He had laughed, and the sound of it in the blooming desert evening was one of the finest things she had ever heard. They married in Sulphur Creek on the 15th of June, 1884, in the small non-denominational chapel that the settlement maintained, which was a square wooden building that was also used for town meetings and occasional theatrical performances. It was a simple ceremony, the kind that suited people who did not require an audience for the important things, though most of Sulphur Creek came anyway, because the town had a stake in this particular outcome that it felt should be witnessed. Maria Delgado sat in the front row and wept without apology. Old Hargrove stood up as Albert's witness, looking simultaneously proud and embarrassed. Florence wore her blue dress, the good one with her hair up but allowing its customary escape of dark curls around her temples, and when Albert saw her at the end of the chapel aisle, his expression was entirely unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before, every wall down, everything visible, and she walked toward it with absolute certainty. The minister read the words. They said the promises. Albert slid a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band that he had ordered from Tucson 6 weeks before the ceremony, and had been carrying in his inside coat pocket for the past 2 weeks, because he had ordered it early with the confidence that the answer was going to be yes. She found that out later and laughed for a full minute. They moved into Florence's homestead, which was now Florence's and Albert's homestead, and Albert finished the repair work that the roof had needed for 2 years and built a proper porch along the front of the house and extended the bedroom wall to accommodate an actual wardrobe rather than the series of hooks that Florence had been making do with. Florence kept working at the trading post, which Hargrove had formally made her co-manager of in April, a promotion that came with a salary increase and actual authority over the accounts and the stock, which was what she had effectively been doing for over a year anyway. Albert stayed on at the Caldwell Ranch through the summer, but in the autumn he and Florence had a long and careful conversation about the future that ended with them deciding together that what they both actually wanted was to build something of their own. They had the homestead property, which was now a full deed after the lease buyout, and there was enough land to run a modest cattle operation. It was not small thinking, but they were not small people. Albert negotiated a part-time arrangement with Caldwell that paid enough to cover costs while they built the herd, and Florence's trading post salary covered the household, and they spent the autumn of 1884 doing the work of building a life in the most literal sense. They mended fences together on weekends. They chose cattle together in October, 3 cows and a bull, a modest beginning, and Albert came home from the transaction looking quietly pleased in a way that Florence found completely irresistible. The first winter as a married couple was cold and dry, and some of the best weeks of Florence Monroe's life. There was the practicality of it, the shared logistical life of 2 people managing a homestead through an Arizona winter, which involved real work and real decisions and occasional real disagreements, and all of it felt more alive than anything Florence had experienced in years. There was the warmth of having someone in the house, someone whose particular presence had become essential to her in ways she had not anticipated even after she had understood she loved him. There was the conversation. She had not known, before Albert, how much she had missed being in conversation with someone who engaged with her entirely, who argued when he disagreed and listened when she argued, and never once suggested that she was too much of anything. And there was the tenderness, the specific, careful, unhurried tenderness of 2 people who had each spent a significant amount of time without being loved properly, learning together what it felt like to do it well. In the spring of 1885, Florence discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday evening while he was mending a bridle at the kitchen table, which seemed to her an appropriately ordinary setting for news that she felt certain was going to change everything. She said it directly, which was the only way she knew how to say things. He looked up from the bridle. His expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something so open and unguarded and quietly overwhelmed that Florence, who was not generally a woman given to tears, found her eyes doing something unexpected. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was very much like him. "I am well," she said. "I am also somewhat terrified, which I imagine is normal." He set the bridle down and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on her head, and she put her hands over his, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a long moment while the oil lamp burned and the Arizona night did its enormous quiet things outside the window. "I didn't know," he said, "that I wanted this." "I know," she said. "Neither did I, not really. Not until it was true." "Are you happy?" he asked very quietly. She thought about it, which was what she did with every important question. "Yes," she said, in a way that is slightly frightening because of what it means to want something this much. He held her more closely. "I know exactly what you mean," he said. "The pregnancy changed the rhythm of things, but not the essential quality of them. Florence worked at the trading post through the summer, which was her decision, and one she made without apology, because the work mattered to her and she was not unwell and she saw no compelling reason to stop. She trained Pete, who had now been at the post for 3 years and was significantly better at arithmetic than he had been, to handle the counter on the days when she needed to be elsewhere. She wrote to her mother, finally, a full and detailed letter about the past several years that she should have written sooner and knew it. Her mother wrote back immediately. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive and was 8 pages long, the longest letter Florence had ever received from anyone, and it contained both maternal anxiety and genuine joy in proportions that felt exactly like her mother. And Florence read it twice and then cried, briefly, and with the contained efficiency she brought to everything, and wrote back that same day. The baby was born in November of 1885, a boy, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first moments of a quality of absolute determination that Florence recognized immediately, and Albert found both terrifying and wonderful. They named him James, after Albert's grandfather who had been, Albert said, the one decent thing in an otherwise difficult family history. James Quinn was 2 weeks old when old Hargrove held him in the trading post, sitting in the chair behind the counter, and said in a voice that was rougher than usual that this was the best thing that had happened in Sulphur Creek since the rain the previous March. Maria Delgado, who was there for this moment, immediately declared herself the child's honorary grandmother, and nobody argued with her, because nobody argued with Maria Delgado, and also because the role suited her perfectly. Albert with the baby was a thing Florence observed with such complete tenderness that it occasionally made her chest physically hurt. He held James with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, but with all the walls down, completely unguarded, talking to the infant in a low voice about entirely practical things, the state of the cattle, the repair needed on the east fence, the quality of the coffee, as if the baby were a reasonable conversation partner who simply preferred brevity. James, for his part, seemed entirely satisfied with this arrangement. Sulphur Creek grew in the years that followed. The railroad was extended through the southern part of the territory, and while Sulphur Creek itself sat a few miles north of the main line, the increased traffic and commerce changed the character of the settlement measurably. New families arrived. A proper school was established in 1886, which Florence was involved in from its first meeting, and when the board needed a teacher for the initial year, she taught alongside her trading post work for 6 months with a baby on her hip at the end of the school day, and an energy that made everyone around her slightly exhausted in the best possible way. The cattle operation grew slowly, and with the care that slow growth requires. By 1887, they had 18 cattle and were turning a modest profit, and Albert had left the Caldwell Ranch to work their own land full-time. Florence moved to part-time at the trading post when Hargrove hired a full-time manager, a capable young woman named Clara who had come from New Mexico with excellent bookkeeping credentials and an extremely practical view of the world, and whom Florence liked immediately and completely. Hargrove retired in 1888 and left the trading post to Clara with Florence as a silent partner and advisor, which had been Florence's idea, and which Hargrove had agreed to with the particular relief of a man who has been waiting for someone to make a sensible suggestion. In the summer of 1887, Florence found out she was expecting again. She told Albert in the same kitchen on a different Tuesday, and the expression on his face was the same unguarded thing, though this time without the terror, only the warmth. Their daughter, born in February of 1888, they named Alina. She arrived into a house that was now a genuine home, 4 years of accumulated living in it, the porch chairs worn from use, and the kitchen table scarred from meals and homework and bridal mending, the shelves full of books that had been accumulating since the day Albert moved in, and Florence discovered the full scope of his library, which ran to history and philosophy and a surprising number of novels, and the whole house carrying the specific warmth of a place that has been well loved. Alina was nothing like James, which Florence thought was perfect. Where James was deliberate and quiet and observed the world with Albert's contained thoughtfulness, Alina arrived with her own opinions at the age of approximately 3 weeks and expressed them without reserve. Florence saw herself in this and found it enormously entertaining. Albert saw it too. "She gets it from you," he said one evening, watching Alina, who was 3 months old, communicated in extremely clear terms that she was not satisfied with the arrangement of her blanket. "I take that as the compliment I believe you intend," Florence said. "I absolutely intend it," he said. They had this rhythm, the back and forth of two people who have learned each other so thoroughly that conversation is both easy and interesting, who can be entirely comfortable in silence and entirely alive in conversation, who have built something together that is larger than either of them was alone and know it. In 1889, the Arizona Territory was in increasing conversation about statehood, and the political activity that accompanied this reached even Sulphur Creek in the form of territorial meetings and votes and considerable debate about what Arizona should look like as a state. Florence attended every meeting she was aware of and had strong opinions about land rights and the treatment of both the Hispanic families who had been in the territory for generations and the Apache communities whose presence and rights were consistently being diminished by the machinery of American expansion. She said these things aloud in public meetings, which some people appreciated and some people did not, and she continued saying them regardless. Albert attended these meetings beside her, listened to her speak with the same attention he had always given her, and when questioned directly by other ranchers about his wife's views said, without any qualification, that his wife's views were her own, and she was better informed than most of the people in the room, and they would do well to take them seriously. Cody Tanner, who was now 15 and had grown into a serious and thoughtful young man, had started working afternoons at the trading post. He had the particular loyalty of someone who has been protected at an important moment and knows it, and he treated Florence with a respect that had nothing to do with the formalities of employer and employee, and everything to do with genuine admiration. He reminded Florence sometimes, in his quiet way, of Albert, and she thought that was probably the best thing she could say about any young man. The ranch grew. By 1890, they had 40 head of cattle and a reputation in the county for fair dealing and quality stock. James, who was 5 and had his father's eye for animals, had already decided with complete certainty that he was going to be a rancher, a decision he communicated to everyone he encountered with the seriousness of a business negotiation. Alina, who was 2, had decided with equal certainty that she was going to do everything her brother did, plus something additional, details to be determined. Florence, at 34, felt the shape of her life with a clarity and satisfaction that she had not thought possible at 28. not because everything was easy. The ranch was hard work, and the territory was still rough in its ways, and there were still droughts and difficult seasons, and the occasional human complication that required management. The work of the school and the post and the community organizations she had become involved in was ongoing and demanding, but the life was hers. It was exactly what she had built, with her own hands and her own stubborn refusal to leave, and it contained the thing she had not known to want until she found it, the specific right person to build it with. She thought about this on an October evening in 1890, sitting on the porch of the homestead, which was no longer quite a homestead but a proper small ranch house with Albert's additions and improvements over 7 years making it something solid and enduring. The sun was setting behind the mesas the way it did in October, that long horizontal light that made everything look as if it had been placed deliberately. James was inside doing the letters and numbers she set him every evening, since the school only ran in mornings, and Florence Monroe was not going to let her children's education stop at noon. Eleanor was asleep already, exhausted from an afternoon of determined and vigorous activity that had included attempting to ride the smallest of the ranch dogs, which the dog had handled with impressive patience. Albert came out and sat beside her in the other chair, and she heard the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening, cattle and horses, and the particular desert silence that was never entirely silent. "Clara says the Hendersons are thinking about the property north of their claim," she said. "I heard Pete mentioned it. It might be worth talking to them. The water rights on that parcel would be useful in a dry year." "Agreed." He paused. "I was thinking about extending the south corral. It would give us room for the spring calves without using the main pen." "That's what I was thinking." Another pause. "James asked me today if we could get a horse of his own." Florence smiled. "What did you say?" "I said he should ask his mother," she laughed. "Coward." "Practical man," he said comfortably. "You're better at the budget." She looked at him. In the evening light, with the desert around them and the house behind them, and the life they had built together fully present in every direction she looked. He was looking at the horizon, that contained, thoughtful face she had been reading for 7 years and still found new things in, the laugh lines that had deepened, the gray that had begun at his temples, the ease that he wore now in the place of the careful containment that had characterized the man who had first come to her counter in 1883. "Albert," she said. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were what they always were in these moments, entirely open. "I am very glad you noticed," she said. He understood what she meant. She knew he would. "So am I," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it in that way he had always held her hand, with the particular care of someone who understands the value of what they are holding, and they sat together on the porch, while the Arizona sky performed its evening extravagance above the mesas, the two of them still and content in the middle of a life that was hard and real and completely, unreservedly theirs. James got his horse the following spring, a bay quarter-horse mare that he named after a character in one of Florence's books, a choice that made Albert smile and Florence feel something enormous and warm in the center of her chest. Eleanor, who was 4, immediately declared that she too needed a horse, and then a dog of her own, and then possibly a cow. And Florence and Albert had a conversation that was mostly them trying not to laugh, and eventually concluded in a compromise involving a very small and extremely dignified cat named Governor that Eleanor accepted with the air of someone who is biding their time. Florence discovered in the summer of 1891 that she was expecting a third time, which surprised her only slightly. She told Albert at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening while he was reading, which she thought was a better setting than a Tuesday. He set the book down and looked at her for a moment and said, "How do you feel?" "Well," she said, "tired, but well." "Good." He came around the table and sat beside her and took her hand. "3," he said. "3," she agreed. "The ranch is going to need more hands eventually," he said, and his eyes were bright. She laughed. "I'm not having children for agricultural purposes." No, but it's a reasonable side benefit. She looked at him and felt the laugh in her chest alongside something much larger, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and the governor the cat asleep in the corner, and the sounds of two children sleeping in the back of the house, and the desert doing its ancient dark outside the windows. The baby arrived in January of 1892, another boy. They named him William, and he was quiet from his first moments in a way that was different from James's deliberate quiet, more contemplative, watching the world with dark eyes that were unmistakably Albert's. And Albert held him the first time with the same extraordinary gentleness he had held James and Eleanor, and said nothing for a long moment, just looked at his son with that fully open, unguarded face that Florence thought was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Sulphur Creek was different by 1892 from what it had been in 1883. It was larger, more established, with a proper school building and a hotel and a doctor's office, and the trading post expanded to 3 times its original size under Clara's management. Some of the roughness had gone out of it, though the territory was still the territory, and it still required the particular combination of practicality and courage that it had always required. Florence Monroe, who was now Florence Quinn in name though she had never entirely stopped thinking of herself by both names, had been part of the building of that difference. She knew it without vanity because she was not a vain woman, but she was an accurate one, and the school and the land rights work, and the quiet sustained advocacy for the families who were most likely to be pushed to the margins of whatever prosperity the territory was developing. These things were hers, built with the same steady determination she brought to everything. She had not been alone in them. Maria Delgado, who was 61 and showed no signs of slowing down, was still the fiercest advocate in the county for the Spanish land-grant families. Cody Tanner, who was 21 now and had left the trading post to pursue a legal education in Tucson, with funds raised partly by Florence's quiet campaign among the settlement's more prosperous households, wrote long letters about land law that she read carefully and saved. Clara managed the trading post with a capability that made Florence quietly proud, and Albert was beside her in all of it, which was the thing that Florence returned to always when she thought about what her life had become. Not because she could not have done it without him. She could have done much of it without him, because she was Florence Monroe, and she had been doing things without adequate support for most of her adult life, and she knew how. But with him was a different thing. With him, the hard things were still hard but not isolating, and the good things were not just good but shared, doubled in some essential way by being witnessed by someone who understood their full weight. He had seen her clearly from the beginning, from the moment she had stood with her arms spread in front of a 9-year-old child and refused to move, and that clarity had not diminished with time or familiarity. He still looked at her the way he had looked at her on their wedding day in the chapel, all the walls down, everything visible. She hoped and believed that she looked at him the same way. In the evenings after the children were in bed and the accounts were done and the practical necessities of the day were attended to, they talked. They had always talked, from those first careful conversations over the trading post floor plan to the long evenings in the kitchen, to the porch conversations in the October dark. And they still did, about the ranch and the territory and the books they were reading and the ideas that interested them and the people they cared about, and the larger things that were happening in the world, the territories approaching statehood, the railroad's effect on the old frontier patterns of life, the rights of people who were consistently overlooked by the official version of progress. These conversations were, Florence thought, the best part of being married to Albert Quinn, which was saying something considerable, given the other parts. James was 7 in 1892, Eleanor 4, and William a new and thoughtful presence in the household, who seemed to be conducting an ongoing careful observation of his surroundings that Florence found both endearing and slightly unnerving, because she recognized in it something that was very much herself. The three children were as different from each other as three people sharing two parents and one household could be, and Florence found this delightful. James was practical and purposeful, and had an affinity with animals that was becoming something real and usable. Eleanor was incandescent and opinionated, and already at 4, clear about the fact that she intended to do whatever she wanted, which Florence supported entirely, and Albert supported with the particular mix of amusement and faint apprehension that Eleanor generally produced in him. And William was watching, taking it all in with those dark, quiet eyes, storing it away. Florence thought that he might be the one who would eventually surprise them, who would turn out to have been comprehending everything from the beginning, and would one day simply announce what he had concluded. She looked forward to it. On a warm evening in April of 1893, Florence and Albert sat on the porch after supper, the children asleep, the desert doing its spring things all around them, the air carrying the particular sweetness of the desert bloom. The ranch had done well this year, the cattle prices were favorable, and there was money set aside now, real money, the kind that meant the future was not precarious in the way the past had so often been. "I got a letter from Hartwell today," Florence said. Albert raised his eyebrows. The Tucson lawyer had become a friend over the years, keeping them apprised of the land rights situation in the territory. "The territorial legislature is considering a bill that would formally codify the Spanish land grants," she said. "He thinks there's a real chance. He wants me to come to Tucson and speak to the committee. Will you go?" "Yes," she said immediately, and then looking at him, "Is that all right?" He looked at her with something that was both tenderness and mild exasperation. "Florence, have I ever once suggested that it wasn't all right for you to do the things that matter to you?" She smiled. "No." "You have not. Then why are you asking?" "Because I want to keep asking," she said, "because we decide things together and that matters to me." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Then yes, go to Tucson, take Maria if she wants to come. I can manage the children and the ranch for a week." "I know you can," she said. "That's one of the best things about you." He smiled, the smile that was still, after 9 years of living alongside it, one of her favorite things in the world. "What are the other best things?" "I'll make you a list," she said. "It will take some time to compile." He reached over and tucked a loose curl behind her ear, the escape curl that had been escaping for 20 years, and his touch was light and certain, the touch of someone who has learned the landscape of another person as thoroughly as they have learned their own. "I love you," he said. Simple, direct, without preamble or qualification, in the way they had said these things to each other for 9 years. "I love you," she said, "completely and without reservation, and I am very glad I did not go back to Columbus." He laughed, which was what he always did when she said this, because she had been saying it since their first anniversary, and it still made him laugh. "I am very glad you did not go back to Columbus," he agreed. They sat together in the warm April dark, with the spring blooming around them and the children sleeping inside, and the ranch quiet and the territory going on in all its complicated, difficult, beautiful existence around them, and Florence Monroe, who had been the bravest woman at the trading post, and had built her life in the hardest soil she could find, held her husband's hand under the enormous Arizona sky, and felt, in the most complete and unqualified sense, at home. The years would bring more things, more work, more seasons, more decisions. James would grow into the rancher he intended to be. Eleanor would become, in the fullness of time, exactly as much as she intended to be, which was considerable. William would one day open his quiet mouth and astonish everyone, which Florence already knew. The territory would become a state, eventually, and the land that had been fought over and loved and exploited and defended would be called something more official than it had been. But it would still be the same hard, beautiful ground that asked everything of the people who lived on it and gave back to those who stayed, something that could not be easily named. And Albert Quinn would be beside her for all of it, the quiet man who had noticed what no one else had noticed, who had walked across a trading post floor and stood not in front of her but beside her, who had seen her clearly from the first moment and had never looked away. That, Florence thought, on the warm April porch, with everything she had built around her and her husband's hand warm in hers, was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.